The Supreme Court ruled yesterday that a 35-foot buffer zone for abortion protesters is unconstitutional under the First Amendment. And Cenk from TYT did a segment on this, so let's listen to him lay out some facts here and also present an argument here. And then I want to come back and talk about it and give you my take, and you may be a little bit surprised.
So when it comes to abortion clinics, again, you're not even allowed to have a 35-foot buffer zone. So let me see that. You see that little red area? That's 35 feet. That apparently, according to the Supreme Court, is too much of a buffer zone. The pro-life protesters have to be closer than that. The Supreme Court buffer zone for its own court is infinitely larger. You don't dare approach the court. I don't give a damn about your free speech. You can't even quite figure out what they're yelling at you. All you know is that they're yelling and they're opposed to what you're doing, but you need to be able to hear the details. When it comes to the Supreme Court, they don't need to hear you at all. You're a million miles away. How come we can't get in your face, Justice John Roberts, as you're walking in? Well, don't I have free speech rights? How about these so-called free speech zones that they set up? Let me show you some of them. Now, when you want to go talk to a politician, you want to protest that, which, by the way, is the core of the First Amendment. And this is often done in conventions. It happened for decades, it's been happening at both Republican and Democratic conventions. Let me show you some of those free speech zones, okay? That's literally what the authorities called a free speech zone. Okay, where they put you in a cage with barbed wire and they say, go ahead, have your free speech. Let me show you another one, okay? And from these places, you're supposed to yell at the politicians that make up our laws. Do you know that, for example, I mean, this is one of many examples. At the Police Center in 2004, the Democratic Convention, those free speech zones were so far away from the convention that they literally could not be seen from the Police Center. They couldn't be heard, they couldn't be seen, they weren't anywhere near that. But the Supreme Court says that's perfectly fine. You want to do speech when it comes to powerful people? No. Get in a fucking cage. Get in a goddamn cage. We don't give a damn about your First Amendment rights. You want to harass a woman trying to exercise her rights, her constitutional rights, by the way? Go have at it, Hoss. She's powerless. Her grandfather's got a cane. She's in a tight spot. And by the way, this doesn't happen to rich people either, by the way. Families of Justice Roberts, Justice Scalia, Justice Thomas, they want to get abortions. They do it in a beautiful place where they can go to a great doctor and a great hospital. They don't have to go to a clinic. No, that's for poor people, middle class people. And they have no power, so you can get right within inches of their face and yell at them at the top of your lungs. That's fine. If you want to actually do First Amendment rights of powerful people, get in a fucking cage. Gee, I wonder why we needed a buffer zone. And all they asked for is 35 feet, okay? In places like this, where they might throw blood against the wall, graffiti clinics like this. Gee, I wonder if you'd be intimidated. They bust into clinics and rip them apart.
Okay, so here's where I think he's 100% correct. He's right about the hypocrisy of the Supreme Court, and it's absolutely overwhelming that when it comes to them, you need to be way further away than 35 feet. But for abortion clinics, well, 35 feet is too long, and you can get a lot closer. And also he's right about when it comes to like politicians at different conventions that, they're in cages essentially. They put you way out of the way where sometimes they can't even hear you and they can't see you. They put you with a fence and some barbed wire and they say, okay, here, now you can do your free speech in this designated area. So he's absolutely right on the hypocrisy front. But here's where he's wrong. There's no question that a buffer zone is unconstitutional, even when it comes to abortion clinics. Now, understand something. It's unconstitutional in all cases, okay? Now, again, the Supreme Court, they're incredible hypocrites when they say, well, we get to have a buffer zone and it gets to be really long, but, the abortion clinics don't. But the answer is that in both cases, they should have said, we're going to get rid of the buffer zone and you could do free speech everywhere. And understand, this case, it wasn't a close case, okay? It was a 9-0 ruling. Now, that doesn't mean that the Supreme Court, when they do a 9-0 ruling, that they're right all the time, because oftentimes they're silly and wrong, as we've seen them many times be silly and wrong, but usually when they're the most wrong, it's in like a 5-4 decision. But this was 9-0 for a reason, and they're actually right about this. We don't need a buffer zone and then a free speech zone, because we're supposed to have a free speech zone called the United States of America. Okay? Now, when he points out instances of violence and vandalism at abortion clinics, it's important to note that that's already illegal. If you do those things, you're going to jail. You can't write "fuck you" on a building and expect not to go to jail, or break into a place and break shit and expect not to go to jail, or throw fake blood and expect not to go to jail, and ruin property and expect not to go to jail, or push somebody and expect not to go to jail. No, in those cases, those things are already illegal and you're going to go to jail. And it's also really important to point out that not all abortion protesters are criminals. They're not all going to do that. Now, understand, it's a really serious problem in many respects, because there are some abortion protesters that are just flat out terrorists. I mean, the guy who killed Dr. Tiller, there's all the time in the United States of America, there's plenty of abortion clinic bombings, and that's a clear case of terrorism. But you can say that everybody else who happens to be against abortion and who might protest abortion, that they're all the same as people who are actually doing vandalism and actually doing assaults. Now, on top of this, here's how we need to look at it. What if there was a 35-foot buffer zone outside of a gun store selling automatic weapons that we were protesting? In that case, a 35-foot buffer zone would be bullshit, wouldn't it? I don't know about you, but I would say, fuck your 35 feet, man. If I want to protest this shit, I'm going to protest it like an American citizen, and don't give me a free speech zone. The whole country is a free speech zone, you son of a bitch. Or what if we were protesting at a Dick Cheney speech? Okay, Dick Cheney's giving a speech on foreign policy and being his usual condescending, idiotic, moronic, Neanderthalic self, and we want to protest, and they say, that's nice, go 35 feet away. What would we say? Fuck you, I'm not going 35 feet away. Or what if we're dealing with, I don't know, Goldman Sachs? Goldman Sachs is doing some sort of convention where they're talking about, oh, how great they are. Meanwhile, they committed, we covered it yesterday, about $2 billion in fraud. Billions of dollars in fraud. They're the biggest criminals in the country. And if we were to go to protest and somebody said, get 35 feet away, we'd say, fuck off, who are you? Don't tell me to go 35 feet away. How random is that? You're picking a number out of your ass. What do you want me to do? What, do you want me to go 38 feet away? You want me to go 23 feet away? No, don't stop. You can't do that. You simply can't do that. So whenever it's an issue that you and I would agree with, then all of a sudden we would realize that the buffer zone is bullshit. But for whatever reason, because we disagree with the protesters themselves, that doesn't mean that we can draw up the buffer zone of 35 feet. But the most important point to bring up about this, he mentions specific instances of violence or intimidation against people going to these clinics. And again, that's already illegal. You already can't do that. You don't need a 35-foot buffer zone on top of that. And again, those people should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law anyway, regardless of the buffer zone. But what a lot of people don't know, okay, is that in 1996 or 2000, I don't remember because there were two different articles that had two different years for the court cases. The Supreme Court already ruled that there is basically this thing called an implied bubble zone, okay, not a buffer zone, but a bubble zone, and that's about 6 feet around you. And that people, protesters, can't breach. And the whole idea behind that is that's your personal space, and that can be viewed as an act of aggression, like a form of assault, where the idea is if you're walking down the street and like you don't want somebody getting in your face, but they're in your face as you're walking, they might not be physically hurting you or punching you or anything, but that is still a violation because they're in your personal zone of about 6 feet around. So there's already that implied 6-foot range, and the Supreme Court did not strike that down. That still exists. So we already have what in my case falls much more in line with the First Amendment, and the 35, I agree, is just way too arbitrary and way too far out. And also for privately owned clinics, you're allowed to kick people off of your property anyway. So it's a privately owned clinic. They can say, get the fuck out. We don't want you here. Okay? They're not allowed to block the door either. So, okay, look, he's right about the hypocrisy. For sure. But he's wrong about the ruling. because whether or not we like it, it was the right decision. It's just that the previous decisions were wrong, where they said you could sit in a fucking cage to protest politicians and get far away from us, the Supreme Court. Those decisions were wrong. This one yesterday was not wrong. So the real answer is to eliminate all the buffer zones. See, the problem is this. What's implied in what he's saying, and maybe he's not saying this, and he can clarify if this isn't what he's saying, but this is certainly how I implied it. What he seems to be saying is, get rid of the buffer zone for the Supreme Court, get rid of the cages for, the free speech zones for politicians when they're at a convention or something, but keep the buffer zone in Massachusetts. No. Because that makes you a hypocrite in the other way, Like the Supreme Court, they're hypocrites in this way, that they're saying, okay, yeah, the conventions and politicians, you get a free speech zone. We get a buffer zone at the Supreme Court, but they don't get one at the abortion clinic. So they're hypocrites. But then you would be the opposite hypocrite if you said, keep the buffer zone at the abortion clinic, but get rid of the ones in the other places. So look, man, I'm a First Amendment absolutist. The only restrictions on speech that are allowed are the ones that we already discussed. So in other words, the cliche examples: fire in a movie theater, bomb on a plane. You can't do libel or slander. You can't do direct threats of violence. But outside of that, man, let's call it like it is. All buffer zones are bullshit. So the hypocrisy of the Supreme Court is 100% clear, and it's 100% wrong. But they did, whether or not we like it, they ruled right in this case. And think about it like this, man. There was a case that was brought in front of the Supreme Court, this is going a long time back now, where white supremacists, the KKK, wanted to march through a predominantly Jewish town and protest. Think about that, man. Now, how do most well-meaning people react to that? Oh, that shouldn't be allowed, right? You know what the Supreme Court ruled? They said, no, that's allowed. Of course that's allowed. You know who argued the case for the KKK? The ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, the group that said, oh, liberal, they're so liberal, this and that. No. They believe in actual rights, even for people who they disagree with the most. Who was it that said, a philosopher said that if we don't believe in freedom of speech for those who disagree with us the most, we don't believe in it at all. So they ruled correctly. And at the time, liberals were upset because the idea was, oh my God, I can't believe this is barbaric. We're letting white supremacists march through, the KKK march through a Jewish town. This is insane. But then later on, liberals came to realize, oh, that's right. It doesn't matter if I agree or disagree with the speech. If they have a right to talk about it either way. So if we can acknowledge that, if we can stand up for the rights of the KKK to protest in the middle of a Jewish town, and that's right that we stood on that side, and liberals can acknowledge that today, we can also acknowledge that a 35-foot buffer zone in an abortion clinic, that's not the right policy. You have the 6 feet, that makes sense because they could be considered an aggressive act if they're inside of your 6-foot bubble, right? But 35 feet, it is arbitrary, it is ridiculous, and I think to disagree with that, you are really infringing on the First Amendment, and that's the wrong idea.